I'm going to start sitting down, but I might get seized by the desire to walk about. First, I would like to thank the organizers, Anya, Dermot, James, and Fred for the audiovisual help, and Jonathan for that nice introduction. So let's get going here. So we'll have four sections. I want to first discuss a little bit about the question of universal emotions. I'll do a behavioral description of the Bezerker. The name comes from the Vikings who tear off their clothes and run into battle. And then I'll do a little bit about the phenomenology of it and the problems of having a phenomenology of it, because in the extreme cases of Berserker rage, there's a lot of memory problems. And so you don't really have too much narrative memory. And so you're reliant on testimony and inference, right? And then I'll try to do a little bit of the neurophenomenology, which can try to account for those memory problems. So, as you may know, there's been a long tradition of people looking at so-called basic emotions. And so Darwin was a proponent of basic emotions, and this is a kind of pop culture thing. I think there's this one of these mind detective guys who reads your face and can tell whether you're a killer or not. But one of the things that we're going to talk about is whether or not part of what we attribute to the Berserker rage is not an inherited mammalian defensive reaction circuit. Now, whether that counts as an emotion or not is one of the things that is under dispute, specifically by Lisa Feldman Barrett. And so she has a long tradition of critical examination of the methodology of the basic emotions research, so the Paul Ekman stuff, when they show pictures to people in different cultures. And so she has some critiques of that. And insofar as she has various neurological reasons for not wanting to be able to, for claiming that there's no fingerprint of necessary circuits. So what she would say is because the whole brain is involved, and she describes it at such a fine-grained level that no one neural instantiation of a emotional episode, even if you, as the experiencer, would say, well, I was as mad yesterday as I was today, or that you're angry, I'm angry, she would deny that the neural circuits are firing in a way that it's necessary for these circuits to fire in order to produce a rage reaction, or also deny the other way, that those circuits could fire but also be producing another emotion. So for those reasons, I think she's a nominalist, but it's all presupposed by really micro-grained analysis of the neural firing circuits. So she's on one position, all the way on the other end, let's say, and I'm going to be in the middle, as you can imagine. The social constructivists, so-called, was an important turn against a kind of reductionist or content-laden version of human nature, which ended up surprisingly having middle-class white guys be the ideal instantiation of human nature. So the so-called linguistic turn wanted to look at ways in which cultural phenomena would produce, and also cultural acts would produce different social categories, producing different meanings, but would not necessarily change the body capacities. So the social constructivists would tend to say, well, okay, we all have these capacities, but what really counts are these cultural overlays. So I have an example of a marriage ceremony here, but since it's in France, it's run by a fonctionnaire, and so there was lots of debates about whether, as you may know, gay marriage was not easily accepted in France, and you go elsewhere, where people have life commitments, but they're not marriages. So that's the sort of social constructivist wing of it. I happen to like what I would call biocultural constructivism. So I think we have lots of training practices. I'm going to exemplify that. We're talking about the Bezerker rage. But a lot of our practices shape the body by interacting with our biological inheritance. Now, Foucault, in Discipline and Punish, one of our people mentioned that earlier, is often thought of as a radical social constructivist, but I don't think it's true. What discipline does is actually changes the body's capacities for repetitive work. He has a lot of stuff about it gets to the level of working on the forces of the body. Right? So it's not just you're going to transcribe someone, you're a criminal, you're innocent, you're a soldier, and you're a worker, but the actual disciplinary practices, as Foucault describes them, change the capacities of the body to withstand repetitive action and develop strength and so on and so forth. So one of the people I like in this area, although I have to change her a little bit, is Susan Oyama. And this is her wonderful book, Ontogeny of Information. And her phrase is nurture is process, and nature is product. But I thought I'd sneak in the second nature there to talk about habituation and that. But it's a pretty deep social, it's a bodily constructivism. Right? You're going to be changing the affective and cognitive patterns and structures that people have. So you could connect this to Raymond Williams and the emotional structures that talks about that different cultures produce different trigger points for their emotions. So, so my position is that what we call the Bezerker rage does have a inherited, biologically deep-rooted mammalian defensive reaction circuit at its base, but different cultures have experimented with different ways to tap into that, to raise or lower the threshold at which that reactive circuit can be accessed. And since human beings have this kind of great plasticity of where you direct our bodily ability to change the intentionality of this rage, different cultures have been able to trigger it in different cases. Now, militarily, the Bezerker rage has been found to be useful. Else it wouldn't have stuck around. I have a pretty strong social, cultural evolution adaptation story to tell. It actually worked, and then the cultures who produced the ability to easily access Bezerker rage in certain circumstances would actually have success, right? But it's really only useful in close range and open field combat. So you have a kind of thing. And so one of the big turning points, and one of the things where the military battles are highly riven with contingencies, is one of the saying that the generals would say, well, you know, you can plan as much for a war as you want, but the other side has a say in the outcome. So the clash between two forms of berserkers, tribes, or groups, that'd be an interesting one. But when the berserkers come up against a phalanx, especially really closely trained professional phalanx like the Romans, then the German berserkers and the Roman phalanx, that was there were hits and misses on both sides. So it wasn't like one would sweep the field. It all depends on the tactics and then this, that, and the other thing. So while it has been useful in some circumstances, it's really not useful, especially in modern warfare, especially in urban peacekeeping missions and so on and so forth. So while in some military cultures have wanted to find ways to provoke it, it's very much discouraged in contemporary, highly mechanized military situations, especially in urban warfare. You don't want berserkers. First of all, the unit cohesion's not going to work, your tactics aren't going to work, and you're going to get terrible public relations because they're going to be getting crazy, and you're going to hurt the really difficult position. Because one of the things that we see is that the police in the United States with SWAT teams tend to take over a kind of occupational structure, but the Army tends to be peacekeeping. So the Army has to do these police functions. as the old joke says, war is God's way of teaching the Americans geography. So we end up in these kind of peacekeeping missions all over the place, and berserkers don't work for that. So it might work for Vikings who want to come in and sack a monastery, but it's not going to work in every military situation. We do see something like this show up, however, in civilian life, quote unquote, in what's called intermittent explosive disorder. And I think that's a clue that you can see these biological capacities we have for this I'm going to explain a little bit, but the Berserker rage is like a hyperactive, reactive aggression, such that anything that appears in the field of vision is a target to be eliminated. Now, there's a spectrum of how intense this is, right? Some people are more in charge of themselves and less. But this intermittent explosive disorder, and we have several psychiatrists here, at least it's in the American DSM, but we see, I think that shows this biological capacity that we have that does not necessarily need military training to have it come out. Sometimes it comes out with trauma or with just idiosyncratic stuff. Now, one of the things, when I mentioned a bit about cultures experimenting with accessing this intense reactive aggression and then pointing it out elsewhere, there's a couple of things here. Psychologists tend to have 4 types of aggression. You see this in the literature. We have the reactive aggression, back in the corner. You have what's called a proactive aggression, when you can try to eliminate the threat before the threat has actually come forward. You can proactively do it, so you need a little more control there. Then you have instrumental aggression, which is the cold-blooded, really scary Hannibal Lecter stuff, where you're just going to plot. If this pays off in your utility calculus, you're going to do it, and your heart rate's not going to get up very high at all. And then a 4th one, which I only learned recently, is redirected aggression. Where if you've been hurt, or if someone has hurt one of your family members, you lash out over here. And this is explained both as a credible belief-enhancing aggressive display to prevent other people from stepping to you, and also in some of the literature is said to have a kind of hormonal relief mechanism, right? Because you're all charged up and you can get rid of it this way. So those 4 ways. So the berserker tends to be reactive, but it can, since we're such complicated creatures, we can also show it moving out proactively. Right? So it's not just you're back into a corner and who's ever in front of you, you're going to eliminate it, but you can also take that state, which was evolved for that purpose, and send it outwards in a kind of proactive aggression. So that's the some of the more complicated things. So I do think that we're mammals, we inherit all these things, but we're really crazy, weird mammals, and we can do things with our biological inheritance that doesn't necessarily fit what it was selected for. Right? So you have the whole acceptation idea. All right, so the next part I'm going to talk about the behavioral characteristics, and there's some very interesting cross-cultural things here. So this is while we have different expressions and meanings, right, what it meant for a Viking to go berserk is not necessarily what it meant for Achilles to go berserk, and I'm going to read Achilles as a berserker. It's not necessarily what it meant for Robert Bales, who was an American murderer of Afghan civilians. Yet there seem to be some behavioral similarities across these things. Plus, I also want to insist that there's a kind of top-down structure to this, so I'm not just a bottom-up biological creature, where a biological thinker where you trigger these things, and then it runs off. You can, and people have in the past, found ways to work downwards to make it easier or harder to trigger these things. So among the common ones, we see grimacing, screaming, contorting, and glaring. We're going to do some stuff in the Iliad about the glare of Achilles' eyes. And this is both to intimidate the other, because a lot of what we've been talking about here is how emotion is interactive. It's between people. It's not just a state that I have up in here, but it's often interactive episodes of emotion. And it also serves to psych yourself up. So if you ever watch boxing, it's kind of a thing like boxers hit themselves, right, in order to get their juices flowing. So here are some statues. This is, oh, what did I do? Okay, there it is. This is a little figurine, supposedly reflecting a white-beam berserker. This is in, I think it's Hamburg, I'm not sure, but it's a statue somewhere in Germany. And you see the grimace on the face and the bodily contortions. And since I'm really grateful for my Irish friends for inviting me and allowing me to talk, and since my mother's side is Irish, I wanted to make sure that we have a little bit of Irish culture in here. So Culturel is described in the cattle raid as undergoing what the English translation is a wasp spasm. These amazing descriptions in the Thomas Kinsella translation of the eyes and the face and everything like that. So this is a ink blot drawing in the Kinsella translation, and this is more just something I stole off the web, but this is the thing. So. And then one of my favorite examples here is because one of the ways that cultures have experimented with accessing the rage would have been war dances. And now the haka is extremely culturally evolved by now. It's used as a gesture of utmost respect at weddings, it's used at funerals. If you want to cry, you should go look at the high school of Jonah Loma, one of the great rugby players, and they did a haka when his hearse went by and there's not a dry eye in the house. So it's assumed lots of things, but it's quite probable that it has its origins in a war dance. And so you get some of those things if you've ever seen a haka, right? It's grimacing, shouting, crying, body contortions, and you're hitting yourself. So this is, I think, one of the testimonies to one of the ways that this worked. Now, while the New Zealanders do this in their rugby matches, actually lots of sports events, one of the responses is for the other team to form a phalanx. Right? If you've seen the other rugby team will lock arms and then stare. So the staring contest is really wonderful stuff. And it kind of shows the individual warfare of the Bezerkers and the solidarity of the phalanx. So if you go online, you can see lots of, like the French and the English, whenever they're playing the New Zealanders. I think the Aussies just kind of look at them. But you do see some phalanx stuff. Okay, so I'm going to do a little dive, not a deep dive, into the Iliad. So I think it's one of the more famous literary descriptions of anger and warfare. And at least arguably, Achilles' last rageful battle with Hector is a description of a berserker. Homer is always able to get into Achilles' mind, and there's ongoing dialogue or monologue inside Achilles, but the description from the outside looks like it's a berserker. So anyway, so we have three main anger terms. We have manes, which is the word that begins the Iliad, like singing to me, O muse, and that's a kind of retributive wrath to redress damage to the social or cosmic order. I'm taking up a number of literary interpretations of these terms. They seem to converge. It seems to be well respected in the Homer scholarship. Then there is kotos, which is a kind of grudge. So whereas manias is when there's been a damage to the social order, Agamemnon steals the slave girl from Achilles, and it's just wrong, right? To do something. Whereas kotos is a little more personal. and is more of a kind of grudge. And then the last one is the kolos, which is a sudden flashing rage provoked by insult or death of the loved one. Now we've done people have done a lot of work with American military people, and so the Bezerkers, as described in Jonathan Shea's book, Achilles in Vietnam, the death of the comrade is a very common trigger for this, and that's why I wanted to have that redirected aggression in here. But it's this sudden flashing thing that takes you over, and the Greeks often describe this in terms of possession by Ares. This thing comes over you. Now, one of the things that Homer is really good at is describing these glaring eyes, and that's why I wanted to bring this into our discussion today, because of the Inhuman gaze. So as he's looking at the armor that's been produced for him anew, because as you know, Patroclus took his old armor, got killed, and he spent like 50 pages fighting over the body. And then his mother, the goddess mother, commissions Hephaestus to make him a new set of armor. No one else could bear to look at it, but Achilles did, and as he did, his anger flashed up, the rage flashed up. And then we see this description of the animal description. So we're going to see that the people possessed by this rage are described either in divine terms or bestial terms. So here is a kind of thing. So we've got the eyes glaring, but also the animal symbol. So here is one for painting that I ripped off the web, but it was open access, so I don't think I'm doing anything wrong. But this is Achilles slaying Hector. And this is Hector in detail. But here is the Inhuman gaze of Achilles. And Fred was talking the other day about the sclera. And so you can tell where the eyes are going with human beings. It's an evolutionary adaptation for a good life. And you see that the artist brilliantly puts in enough white to be able to show. And then, of course, you've got the spear too here, controlling his eye. So that's the full picture. And then we've got the interlocking eyes of Hector and Achilles, and showing that the episode is an interactive, ongoing website. Okay, so we've done a little bit of a discussion about whether it's universal or not, and I'm kind of the basic neurological baseline, I think, is inherited, but there's lots and lots of cultural overlay as to when it's able to be triggered, etc., etc. Actually, one last thing. There's a very fine line, because a lot of the descriptions here, the Berserkers, show that the triggers for them also end up, in the behavioral aspects, end up as trauma as well. So the line between traumatizing a young boy to bring him into a warrior culture and training a young boy to make him into a warrior is a very fine line. So I tell this story that in the Odyssey, when Odysseus is in disguise and he's being ready to undergo his interview with Penelope, still disguised as a beggar, she says to the maid, well, we should bathe our guest here. And the maid was his old maid as a child. And as she's bathing him, she sees the scar on his thigh from his last rite of passage as a young man before he becomes a full-fledged warrior. He was sent out with a spear against a wild boar. So is that trauma or is that training? It's scarred here, but obviously wins because he's Odysseus. But that's so all that stuff I was talking about in terms of the cultural experimentation with accessing these reactive emotion, reactive circuits is a fine line between training and trauma. Okay, so let's look at this. In lots of testimony today, I mentioned a book by Jonathan Shea called Achilles in Vietnam. And the American GIs also testified to either this divine uplift, right? I was immortal, I couldn't be killed, I was just right? So they describe this possession, and so possessed by Ares. Or they're describing it as a descent into the bestiality. Right? So this is one of the more frightening passages in the Iliad. I mean, Homer's wild, but this is when Hector asks for quarter with Achilles, and that's his reply. And this is Henri Rousseau. Since we're in France, I'm going to have a French artist up there too. But this is the hungry lion throws himself on the antelope by Henri Rousseau from 1905. I'm a little hesitant to do that because the Bezerker rage I don't think is predatory. I think if it's evolved, if you're going to tell an adaptational story, it's going to be a prey reaction. I don't think that the lion is actually as blind with rage as the antelope would have been if trying to fight for its life. So there's more of a possession in a predatory animal because they have to be, because if the prey starts to move, they have to. Whereas if you're backed into a corner, you're just going to, anything that moves, you're going to try to kill. But like I said, with humans, you can exact that defensive mechanism and send it outwards as well. But in fact, we were talking about this a little bit today. Like when we say fight with tooth and claw for actual, for human beings, that's one of the most things that most elicit horror. Right? That you were so angry you would bite someone. I mean, that's really, we don't kill people by biting them and stick them with spears and rocks and so on and so forth. But if you'd be that angry that you would claw and bite. So hence you get that the divine, I couldn't be touched, and the bestial, eat you. Hera says at one point that if I could, I would eat the flesh off of the Trojans for what they did. Okay, so this is a nice book by a practicing psychologist in a small town, Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And he says, look, this is only like 40,000 people in this town, and yet I come across anger and difficult, intermittent explosive disorder and a bunch of stuff. People come to me and I can't control my anger. And I'm in a small town. So he has three nice things, and I think it does fit with some of my other reading. So there's the first step is you lose control of your behavior, but you feel it's still you. So in Sean or Dan Zahavi's terms, there's still ownership, right? You can still identify yourself as the actor, but there's a little distance between what you recognize as your normal behavior pattern and this loss of control. The next one is when people say, well, and then I was a different person. That still has enough ownership, to use the phenomenological term, I think, to have a comparison. Right? This I was a different person. Right? So you still have enough I there to be able to make that thing. The most extreme case, however, is called blackout rage, and you really don't have much episodic memory. You do have some affect memory, and you have some sensory fragmentation, but you don't have much narrative stuff. So that's a really problematic case for an extreme phenomenology. What are you supposed to do with that? It's an experience, right? But it's very difficult to inhabit, or even talk with somebody who's gone through this because they really don't know. So I went and did some, so these are quotes from the book, so we'll go a little quicker here. And I pulled up some Bacon images there, so I'm not sure if I've got them in the right order, but this is the I snapped, but it's still enough of myself, but I feel I was something else. I wasn't my normal self, but I was still myself. This is the second stage, becoming someone else. I felt that I was someone else at the time, but you're still I was someone else, so you're still nothing. And then it has some testimony about the eyes, the glaring eyes there. So that would be an interesting thing to work. And then the last bucket is the study for one of the Pope paintings. And that this is the example when people trying to recall cannot recall the narrative. They can kind of recall the triggering event, and then it's very consistent. They'll say, and then the next thing I knew, right? And so there was, and then they have to kind of piece it together, right? Because then he says, well, what happened? And then the people there tell him what happened. Right? And this is the segue to this trial of the American GI Robert Bales, who went berserk in Afghanistan and killed about 20 civilians. And during his testimony, he says, well, I don't recall during this one particular act, which was burning down a house. But he does admit, I must have done it. It's the only thing that makes sense. So there's this kind of inferential stuff from the evidence. I must have done it. So I think we can talk about 4 selves here. So I do think in the grip, the organism in the grip of this berserker rage has an intentionality, right? It's being able to act, identify. You don't. I think people do berserkly pound on the wall and stuff like that, but there's enough of the ability to recognize other living creatures and have this overwhelming desire to kill them. So there is a kind of automatic pilot. The organism has a body subject, but it seems to be kind of cut off from its narrative capacities. Then you could also look at the abiding subject the substance to which other people can attach events. Right? So in the second person, you did this, or the third person, he did that. So there's a way in which the Bales, although he doesn't have any memory of it, it was still Bales, the body subject, who performed it. Then we have this kind of inferential self. It's the only thing that makes sense. And finally, I would say the kind of narrative self when you take it up into your own story. I must have done that. So this kind of assumption of responsibility from inference from outside testimony. Okay, so going to the last part of the paper, and we have 7 minutes left. By the way, this PowerPoint presentation is on my blog. It's not yet on my website. But if you look at John Protevi's blog, the top article has a link to the PDF of this if you want to save these things. Okay, so we're going to look at 3 people, Griffiths, Panksepp, and Ledoux. So Griffiths is a philosopher, is mostly associated with the developmental systems theory and philosophical biology, but he is also, his first book is Cognitive Psychology, look at whether emotions are a natural kind. And he decides that they aren't, basically, and one of the things he wants to distinguish are these kind of basic affect programs, which as he describes, complex coordinated but without conscious direction. And I think there's a kind of computer metaphor there that the hardware gets taken over by a different software. He would claim that there's no kind of pre-reflective self-awareness, but that's where the phenomenologists would have to fight about it. Panksepp is a guy who wrote this book in 1998, Affective Neuroscience. And he's a basic emotions guy, and one of the things that he's able to, one of the things he claims is that evidence from direct neural electrical stimulation, in particular parts of the brain of cats or other experimental animals, that you can provoke this kind of rage reaction that we saw from the drawing of the first page of the cat. You can provoke that from direct stimulation. So he claims that that's going to be a homologous, meaning common descent, subcortical rage circuit in humans and other mammals. And then, again, that's the distinction that he makes between the hot rage as a prey reaction, and you can tell an adaptational story for that. If you might as well fight for your life if you're back in the corner, because otherwise you're going to die. Versus the predation, which involves a cold type of aggression. And Joseph Ledoux, I think, is known as a constructivist in the philosophy of emotions, or cognitive science of emotions people. So he's closer to Lisa Feldman Barrett, but not as extreme. So I want to call him a moderate constructivist. So contra Barrett, he does identify specific neural circuits, and I think it's just because he allows for a more coarse-grained description of the neural firing patterns. I mean, I think it is true that if you go really down, really, really fine-grained, that when I was angry yesterday, firing differently than I'm firing today. However, if you go up, you know, I don't know what the great metaphor would be, but decrease the granularity of your description, you're going to see some. So he allows for some specific circuits. And his actual theory of emotion ends up that emotions are high-level semantic labelings of a kind of recipe of unconscious things, which would be bodily states, neural components, and have to be filtered through the culture and the semantic labels you have, so you can identify, oh, this is anger, this is fear, this is disgust. That's not as important as his concession that we have these identifiable circuits. So he's neither Barrett nor Pensar, so I like him. I don't want to go through these things. We could talk a little bit more about it. For one, I'm not a neuroscientist, but Ledoux is famous for having this fast road, slow road idea, so you get a kind of gist of the situation fast, and then you're going to be provoking your, first you get a freeze reaction, but then you get this defensive reaction, and it sends signals to parts of the brain, and the hormonal system, and there's a whole bunch of stuff there. But then you get the, you know, in normal terms, it's really quickly afterwards, but in brain terms, it's slower. Then the cortex is going to come online and be able to evaluate the situation to upregulate or downregulate the immediate reaction. So he's quite famous for this kind of two-story, two-road thing. And for him, even the cortical analysis is still going to be non-conscious. Yeah. So I think I will end with this slide. Well, maybe, yeah, there are some other neuroscience stuff. But what is interesting to me about humans is, as I said, we have this kind of excitation capacity where we can take this mammalian inheritance, but work with it, raise or lower both our thresholds for activating it. Whether that's you traumatize the boys of your culture by making them fight wild boars, or put them through military training, or other kind of things. We have these communal practices, chanting, screaming. In fact, Fred and I need to talk quite a bit about the way in which the war parties will psych themselves up in this, and scare the other people, chanting. And then this kind of top-down self-messaging, right? The Greeks had these capacities. You've been wrong, right? And the anger that you're feeling as a retributive rage is something that Zeus does, and Poseidon does, and Hera, and everybody like that. So there's ways in which that's a culturally approved way, and then holding a grudge, which is not supposed to be good for us, but the heroes are described as holding grudges in the Iliad. Keep looking at Sean because it's a big difference between our cultures, but these are the heroes of the Greek culture, right? Hold grudges, they're angry, and they flash into these rages. So that, I want to insist on that top-down emphasis for us to, partially to fight against my own temptations to be kind of reductionist and neurocentric or something like that. So fighting against it, I'm going to insist on the semantic and the culture. Okay.
Okay, so we have 10 minutes for questions. Start with you, Fred.
John, wonderful talk. Thank you very much. Yes, there's something very enticing right here about the link between these synchronized practices that may precede this. I'm put in mind, though, of altered states of consciousness that come about through such synchronized practices, particularly in Sufi chanting, which is which also makes use of very repetitive breathing.
Yes.
And I think these kind of heavy synchronized breathing practices can be very, very effective. When you pause posit a biocultural model. Borders are really weird here. I don't know that there are borders. But wouldn't it be fascinating if if there's something to this story, if the same biological circuits could produce rage on the one hand and communion with the divine on the other?
Well, I think the practice is, I mean, one of the great books I've read in the last 10 or 15 years is a book, I'm really obsessed with this stuff, but called On Violence by Randall Collins, who is a micro-sociologist. In one of the chapters in there, he interviews mafia hitmen. And you would think that they were Hannibal Lecters. And he said, something, well, they aren't. They're discussed and so on and so forth, but they train themselves. For one, they do a lot of breathing exercises, and you can keep their heart rate down through breathing exercises. And we see this in sports when you do the biathlon. You do the cross-country skiing, right? And then they have to sit here and shoot. So lots of people will testify that once your heart rate gets above about 180, you lose your muscle control. So if you're going to be a cold-blooded killer, even if you have emotions, right? Now, if you're just a complete cold fish, you can do what you want. But these guys have to learn how to keep control. So one of the things they do is that they do stuff like what we know from the firing squad. They don't look in the eyes of the victim. And so that's the bit about the mafia head from behind is also to enable the guy. And then they also have a kind of checklist of what they need to do. Right? So by concentrating on those technical aspects of their task, they're able to keep their emotions in check and be able to do that. In fact, in what's his name, Breivik's, Anders Breivik's trial, he testified that he first made elaborate plans, did all sorts of mental exercises to try to come through with it, and then failed the first time. He couldn't go through with it. He had to go back and redo his mental practice in order to be able to do that. So you can upregulate it, you can do that, and then you can just kind of downregulate it. So breathing practices in particular. The communing with the divine, that's, like I said, it's quite a widespread thing. Now, is it because the soldiers in Shea's analysis know as Westerners about this humans are between animals and gods, right? So this tripart thing, you don't have to learn that in college. You can do that, but they're quite consistent in having that kind of description of their own activity. Quite a few of them said, "I felt like a god."
Brian?
Thank you. That was very cool. Thanks so much. I'm wondering if you could say something say something about the place of like the skillful or the technical in the berserker. Because after all, the reason why Achilles is a terrifying berserker, more terrifying than someone equally athletic with the sword and knowing what he's doing with it. And just like boxers don't go totally berserk because they might get sniped by the collected nation before him. So.
No, that's great. I mean, I think, it's probably why Ajax is a great hero. It's Achilles, because he can maintain his skill even in grips. Like I said, Homer allows for dialogue and monologue in the mind of Achilles, and yet we've seen if we continued on, we would have gotten to this memory problems where you get this kind of post-stress amnesia where you don't actually have so-called flashbulb memories. And you don't actually have the ability to recall that. Now, is that because at the time you actually had a narrative structure and it gets wiped out? Or that in the act it's so intense that you don't actually have, like the prefrontal cortex cuts out and there's nothing there to encode? That's the neuroscientists will have to talk about that. But yeah, I think that's correct. I think that the people, I mean, cats are better hunters than other cats, and dogs, and better fighters. And sometimes it's will beats skill. The underdog is it's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fighting the dog. That's a kind of common wisdom, right? So there's skill, and then there's just, like I said, one of the slogans is that will beats skill. If you're willing to suffer a broken arm, right, in your fighting, even if you don't have the skill and your opponent is skilled but doesn't want to risk a broken arm, probably win. But I'm not an expert on tree fights.
John, I want to ask you a question about René Girard's theory of sacrifice and violence. You know that according to René Girard, one of the most universal processes that was used by societies in order to control violence, in order to avoid the propagation of rage and revenge in the whole society, was sacrifice. Well, that means concentration of the violence on an innocent victim. So my question is, why is this process so efficient, so universal? What kind of violence does it control? Is it only collective social violence, or also the kind of individual violences you
Well, I would have to look at Girard more carefully. It's I know there's kind of outlines of the scapegoat theory. What we do see culturally in the pre-agricultural small-scale forager bands is a practice of capital. It's a series of punitive practices against those who deploy unjustified violence within the band. So you're going to get insult, you're going to get ridicule, you're going to get ostracism, you're going to get exile, and if you have to, you will have capital punishment. So this is well attested by a great ethnographer named Christopher Bowman. And that is part of what's called the human self-domestication thesis, which is proposed by a number of anthropologists and psychologists today. Now, but that's targeting specifically guilty people. So what I would ask myself is whether Girard's analysis isn't of a larger scale societies in which you have lots of anonymous interchanges. The thing about the small scale is everybody knew everybody. Everybody was up in each other's business, to use the my students always mock me relentlessly for trying to use hip-hop language. But there's no privacy in the small bands, and there's no... so I'd be interested to see, and I seem to remember Girard talking about larger scale societies in which there's anonymity. But I don't know. But it's something that I would like to look into.
Okay, so we have Sean, and then we have two more questions on the Senate remark.
Thanks, John, for a great talk. On the cultural side, you point to a lot of training and practices that would put someone in a good position to then carry out this kind of activity. But are there any other larger scale unintended type structures or practices that lead people in this way that are not deliberate, not intended?
Our well-known philosophy colleague Owen Flanagan claims to be able to show cross-culturally that Americans are the maddest people, the angriest people. He has this stuff about how while you're waiting in line at Starbucks and somebody offers a bubble or this, that, and the other thing, and then tries to pay with coins. And people are just really angry about it. I don't know. I mean, you could link that up to precarity, maybe, a destruction of social security kind of things. And so you feel threatened all the time. If I don't get to my job, if I can't get the bus, I don't get to my job, the kids are going to be in danger. So that kind of living on the edge in contemporary America might push a number of people towards that. What I'd really like to investigate also would be global and cultural peacemaking capacities. How is it that cultures have interrogated and experimented ways to keep people away from Bezerker? You know, because my research up to now is about how we're ready to do this. But, I mean, war is not a universal human experience. Violence, murder, and vengeance are, but not necessarily group warfare. So what is it about? Now you could say that for the forager bands, it's as simple as materialist in the anthropological sense. There's just not enough at stake. Why would a forager fight for territory? They're on the move in another 30 days anyway. Doesn't make any sense. There's no cattle. There's no input into the land. So when Locke says that agriculture improves the land, well, yeah, there's a reason to fight there, right? Because you can come in and steal 40 or 50 years worth of improvement of the land by displacing the people who had actually done the work and cleared the rocks and so on and so forth. That's something to fight for. But the foragers, yeah, let's move over to the next hill. So what it's called in the anthropological literature the fishing-fusion relation, and fishing is a really good peacemaking practice, right? Plus, the foragers also are rich in social relations. If you work together with someone, they're going to remember it, and they're going to teach their kids that we owe these people something. So there's a number of hardcore biological materialist anthropologists who argue that war on the foragers does not make anthropological sense. It's just not enough at stake. So that's not necessarily, though, a culture that tries to avoid war. That's an ecological, political economy that avoids war without necessarily thematizing it. They might not necessarily say, well, we're peaceful people. It's more like, well, why do you want to fight us?
Thank you. I was interested in this idea of memory loss as being a criteria for the Bezerker rage.
The highest, most intense form people complain about memory.
Yeah, and obviously I understand the theory, which is this idea that you're so roused that something shuts off.
Right.
But I guess I have maybe some skepticism about that, as I presume judges might do as well. And there are a couple of things that occurred to me about that. So one, I wondered about, say, we use the Iliad as a representation of Bezerker. I wonder if there are older accounts of this memory loss, embedded in first-person accounts, because I would assume that in the Iliad, I went berserk, I killed him. He deserved it. Justice was served. That was me. I did it, and I'm telling my story.
Right.
And I was interested in you talking about Eclair and people presenting the Lord saying, I'm angry. I see that a lot now. And I think we live in a culture where there's not that much purpose for our very aggressive natures, actually. We are aggressive, but we live in cultures where, a culture right now, where there's very few acceptable outlets for it. And I just wondered again about unconscious factors actually motivating people to forget.
Yeah, no, this is good. I mean, there are some, we'll come up and do some neuroscience about this.
And cultural factors.
These folks talk about the different rates of plasticity as the emotional, as the neurotransmitters and so on and so forth reach a peak. So there's a kind of materialist account for it. Other people might say sometimes that this memory loss is adaptive. One of the real problems here, and one of the things I wrestle with, is that most of this stuff comes from trauma victims. And there's a lot of testimony of just this kind of fragmented thing that they have to bring themselves back to. So Kate and I read Susan Boyson's book, Aftermath, which is a harrowing account of her recovery. So, but a lot of this stuff is from victims' accounts, but some of the soldiers also do the thing. In terms of law and neuroscience, I don't think for a while, some people have tried the so-called gay panic defense, where I blacked out, I don't remember, and then I woke up and that was that. That's not really allowed in American courts at all anymore. It was a small period of time that it was. So I'm not an expert on law and neuroscience, but I think that it's easily enough handled, although we're supposed to only put away people who are culpable because they were in the right mind, and they knew the difference between right and wrong. You can end up putting people away, either medicalizing them or by legal means because they're dangerous. Not necessarily because they're guilty, but because there's such hair-trigger time bombs that we can't have them on the street. So there might be ways that the legal system works there. They're not supposed to do it. The story gets through to the jury that we can't afford this guy on the street anymore. That's if they're not able to do involuntary commitment for psychiatric reasons. And you know a lot more about this than I do. The one thing I do know is that the gay panic defense is not a legal defense anymore in the United States, which is one of the ways that people tried to do that. I don't recall anything, but they don't do that anymore. It's not admissible.
Actually, we're right up against time, so what we get time to take the final question? It's 7:30 now. Could we? Yeah, this is so. Could we keep this final question short? Is that okay? Yes. At the back.
My question was also very much about the memory loss or the blackout, and especially because I remember that what people who suffer trauma, one thing that they really suffer from is that they cannot forget. Indeed, they have a very, very detailed memory which comes back all the time, wakes them up at night.
Well, some of those are intrusive affective waves, and sometimes you get this kind of fragmented sensory images, right? But I think there's a wide variety of symptomatology here, and there's going to be a number of things. But intrusive memory from trauma victims as a diagnostic criteria for PTSD is very well tested. Right? The involuntary memories that haunt you and you can't get away from, sure, that's quite there. Question would be how much narrative content is there, and whether that narrative content hasn't been filled in by inference and testimony. So that we'd have to get into the literature and see what the PTSD literature on that. But sure, involuntary, intrusive memories as a symptom of trauma, it's very well tested. Sure.
Can we put our hands together then together for John Protevi?
Holy God. Paul and James and myself to wrap proceedings up. I think that we're not going to keep you with a long diatribe. You'd be giving us the side eye if we did. I think it needs to be said that Anya conceived of this conference. She identified the theme, embellished, worked, and put out the tentacles, and attracted an enormous amount of interest. The surge of submissions we got, the enthusiasm of the conference, the depth of the engagement has been astonishing. Anya, thank you. Thank you very much. Give yourself a hand.
Thanks also to, Audio also has as well, so Jonathan, Mark, and Aviva, and Campus as well. And also to everyone who volunteered to serve the last few days, because kind of kept it all going for us.
I'm just going to say a very quick word. My team were absolutely fantastic. Fred, James, Jonathan, Clemens, Aviva, absolutely superb. And Mark, everyone's been just so superb. So, give Jonathan up.
All over the line.
I have this. Oh yes. Oh, hang on. I forgot. Aviva started just a quick search.